Chapter 16. On the bus ride to school, Nick told Marta about Smoke's surprise visit. She said, "You mean that maniac knows where you live? That's not cool." "He just wanted to borrow my biology book." "Oh, I'm so sure," Marta said. "To study for an exam is what he said." "What exam? There's no exam, is there?" "Not that I know of. It's weird," Nick said. And then he took off before I could ask him about Mrs. Starch. Marta frowned. "Don't go there, Nick. Just let it drop." After their encounter with the man called Twilly, Marta had lost some of her enthusiasm for solving the mystery of Mrs. Starch's disappearance. Nick said, "I checked out a book by that writer Twilly talked about, Edward Abbey. It's called The Monkey Wrench Gang, and the hero is a wild dude named Hayduke who wants to blow up a dam." "What for?" Marta said. "Because it's plugging up a huge wild river. So he and the other guys launch like a big underground war." "All guys, huh?" "There's a lady in the gang, too." Sticks with comments, Nick. Stick with the comments, Nick. Seriously, it's a good story and funny. What's it got to do with Mrs. Starch? Nick shook his head. "Who knows? Maybe nothing." "Look, I really don't care where she is or what she's doing," Marta said. "I just want her to come back to Truman so we don't have to deal with Waxo anymore. A witch that knows how to teach is better than a fruitcake from Mars." "Smoke said Dr. Waxmo's gone." "No way," Marta exclaimed jubilantly. "Whatever happened, Smoke acted like he had something to do with it," Nick said. Sort of sketched me out." Marta clapped her hands. "I can't believe we're really rid of Wacko Waxmo. It's too good to be true." "Well, we're going to find out soon." Sure enough, a different substitute was sitting in Mrs. Starch's desk when Marta and Nick walked into third period biology. They exchanged glances and took their seats. Graham was already waving his hand at the teacher, whose name was Mrs. Robertson. Most of the kids knew her because she was substituted regularly at the school. "Dr. Waxmo has called in sick," she began, "some sort of nasty flu bug, according to Dr. Dressler. So it looks like I'll be teaching the class until Mrs. Starch returns." When the students broke out in a grateful applause, Mrs. Robertson tried not to smile. Wendell Waxmo was unstable personality was legend among the other substitutes. When the celebration was over, she said, "All right, let's get down to business. You have a question, Graham?" The boy lowered his hand and said, "I'm ready with page 263. "Oh, I memorized the whole thing like Dr. Waxmo told us to. Gametes and chromosomes." "That's good," Mrs. Robertson said patiently, "but I use a different teaching method than Dr. Waxmo's, and I find it more helpful to study chapter by chapter instead of choosing random pages." Graham looked crestfallen at Mrs. Robertson's instructions and students to open their textbooks to chapter 10. It was then Nick noticed that Smoke was absent, which meant that Nick's biology book was absent too. He would have to share with somebody. Marta passed him a note. "Where's your new friend?" Nick shrugged. Maybe new and proved Dwayne Scrooge Jr. was back to his old ways. Torkelson parked his SUV at the dirt road and approached the helicopter where the oil man was waiting. "Hop in," he said to the fire investigator. Torkelson strapped himself in on one of the seats. "When did you find it?" he asked. "About an hour ago. I called you right away," Jimmy Lee Bayless said. The chopper ride took only about 3 minutes, and Torkelson looked out the window while Jimmy Lee Bayless chewed up a handful of Tums and hoped that the fire investigator wouldn't ask him about the tool marks on his lips. The helicopter touched down in a dry clearing, and the other two men stepped out. Jimmy Lee Bayless leading the way. "Watch out for rattlers," he warned. "You bet," the fire investigator said. They made their way to the hammock of cabbage palms. The camel print book bag lay on the ground, partially concealed by dead fronds. Jimmy Lee Bayless thought he had done a very convincing job of planting the evidence. Torkelson picked up the bag and examined it. "We were doing a flyby when I saw some wild hogs running through those trees," Jimmy Lee Bayless said. "So I had the pilot set her down and I took off with my rifle. Didn't catch those pigs, but I did come across this thing and figured you might be interested." The fire investigator unzipped the pockets of the satchel and carefully sorted through the contents. "What the heck's in there?" said Jimmy Lee Bayless, as if he didn't know. He had been careful to remove any assignment papers that were dated after the arson. Otherwise, Torkelson would have figured out the book bag couldn't have been left by the scene at the day of the crime. "School books, pencils, calculator," Torkelson said, "and this." From one of the compartments, he pulled out a small butane torch. Jimmy Lee Bayless whistled. Wow, you hit the jackpot. Torkelson used a digital camera to take pictures, placing the book bag and the torch on the mat of the palm fronds. This isn't far from where the fire was started, right? Jimmy Lee Bayless said, again as if he didn't know. The kid must have stashed his stuff here before he took off. Sure looks that way. Torkelson jotted down the brand and model of the butane torch, which Jimmy Lee Bayless also purchased at his favorite hardware store right on the way home from his screwed household. Jimmy Lee Bayless had tested the device by using it to burn up the sales receipts so that it could never be traced to him. The fire investigator repacked the book bag, slung it over one shoulder, and followed Jimmy Lee Bayless back to the helicopter. The pilot lifted off and made an extra-wide turn to avoid flying over the area of Section 22 where Red Diamond Energy was erecting its illegal oil drilling platform. Even though the site was well concealed among the woods, Jimmy Lee Bayless wasn't taking any chances, especially with a sharp-eyed passenger such as Torkelson. When the chopper landed on the dirt road, Jimmy Lee Bayless got out and walked through the fire investigator to his SUV. Is there a name tag in the backpack? Jimmy Lee Bayless said. Yep, said Torkelson. It's the same kid I told you about, Dwayne Screw Jr. Wow, then you have your arsonist. Torkelson placed his incriminating bag in the back of the SUV. This is a big help, Mr. Bayless. Thanks a million. Call me any time, Jimmy Lee Bayless silently congratulated himself as he returned to the chopper, though he wouldn't have had as much merry spring in his step if he had known that he was being spied on at that very moment. Perched halfway up a cypress tree and shielded by the branches was Twilly Spree, sucked on a slice of store-bought grapefruit and waited for the Red Diamond helicopter to fly away. Then he climbed down and waded down slowly at the strand. The spiders and mosquitoes didn't concern him, nor did the poisonous snakes and the snapping turtles. Twilly was utterly at ease in the black vine swamp. He was almost as at ease in any wilderness. He felt much safer after hiking among a few hungry gators and bears and then driving down Interstate 75 at rush hour, as he did every morning before the oil company workers arrived. Twilly went searching for signs of a particular panther. He would have been elated to see one measly paw print, but he found nothing. Twilly hadn't laid eyes on the animal since the day he heard the 2 rifle shots in the area. He never came across the body or any spots of blood, so he concluded that it had safely gotten away. On the day of the fire, Twilly had heard a panther scream. There was no mistaking the hair-raising wail, and he chose to believe it was the one that he had been seeking. The sooner the feline returned to the territory, the better. This was only truly a matter of life and death, although not Twilly's own. On the trail leading back to camp, he encountered the kid. You're supposed to be in school, Twilly said. I dreamed I saw a cat. Where? On the boardwalk, said Dwayne Jr. I had to check it out in case it was like an Indian dream, but it wasn't. Too bad. Twilly himself rarely dreamed, but he knew Seminoles and mosquitoes had visions that sometimes came true. Facing the sun, Dwayne Screw Jr. squinted in and out of the swamp. So you didn't find anything? No tracks? Twilly shook his head. A bobcat and some deer, that's all. You saw the chopper, right? Don't worry, Dwayne Screw Jr. said. They didn't see me, and I hid the bike real good. You need to get your bottom to school. The alternative is not pretty. Yeah, I know. Did your book bag ever turn up? Nope, I swear I took it home, the kid said, but I can't find it anywhere. Weird. You ask your old man? Dwayne Screw Jr. snorted. He locked himself in the music room with that crazy bird. Says he chased off a government taxman the next day and that they're going to send the FBI. There's no use to talking to him when he gets like this. The boy clearly had a rocky situation at home. His mother had run off to Europe and his father didn't always have both oars in the water. Twilly Spree felt bad for him, although not bad enough to risk blowing the mission. Hey, I saw the bottles got here, Dwayne Jr. said. Yep, everybody's okay for now. That's a cool thing you did. Go to school, Twilly said, and don't make me say it again. Right, later, dude. Watching the boy walk away, Twilly wished he had better been qualified to give out advice and wisdom. However, he spent most of his own life following his gut impulse instead of his brain. He was hardly the proper role model of a sensible grown-up. He headed back to the camp, moving quietly by habit through the marshes and the prairies and the tree islands. On a soggy stretch, he came upon something dark in the middle of the trail. Something he hadn't been there earlier in the morning. Twilly dropped to the ground, put his face closer in order to be sure. Eagerly, he stuttered the fresh find. He poked at it with a twig, turned it with a leaf, and even sniffed it. There was no doubt it was panther poop. Dr. Dressler's day turned sour when his lunch was interrupted by the arrival of George and Gilda Carson. They had come to make their weekly plea to have their brilliant son Graham moved up a grade or two at Truman. Based on Graham's most recent report card, which Dr. Dressler held in his hand, Graham was exactly where he should be. He's a C+ average, Dr. Dressler reminded the Carsons. There's nothing wrong with that, but it tells me that your son has some challenges. He has all the challenges he can handle right now. What do you mean by that, huffed Gilda Carson. Yeah, what are you driving at? George Carson climbed in. Part of Dr. Dressler's job was putting up with the unreasonable demands of parents, but sometimes it wasn't easy to be polite. We don't normally advance a student unless he or she has straight A's, he explained, and then only if they pass a series of tests showing they're ready to skip ahead of all the other students their age. Gilda Carson said, we told you to give Graham those tests. And I did, Dr. Dressler handed them a copy of his not-so-brilliant son, which she showed to her husband. So, he had one bad day. Big deal, said George Carson. Let him take the test again. Dr. Dressler glanced wearily at the brass clock on his desk. He said, Graham is a fine young man. He pays attention in class. He asks lots and lots of questions, and he tries hard. But what? Sneered Graham's mom. But he's a C+ student. Which is the fault of the teachers, Dr. Dressler. Clearly, Graham is underachieving, George Carson said, waving the test paper, and that shouldn't happen at a place like here. We pay an arm and a leg for tuition. Dr. Dressler tuned out the arm and a leg speech, which he had heard dozens of times from parents who decided to blame the school because their children were falling short of their expectations. More often than not, the students improved with a little help and went on to graduate with solid marks. However, the Carsons were in no mood for a pep talk, and Dr. Dressler was in no mood for the Carsons. He was on the verge of saying something very frank to them when his assistant cracked open the door. Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Dressler, but Detective Marshall is here to see you. Certainly, right away. The headmaster was relieved to get rid of the Carsons, who departed grousingly, but he was worried about this new visit from the sheriff's detective. It probably wasn't a social call. Once Jason Marshall entered the office, he got directly to the point. I'm here to arrest Dwayne Scrooge Jr., he said. For the fire in the swamp? The detective nodded soberly. Dr. Dressler's spirits sank as he envisioned the awful headline, Truman student busted for arson. Because he's still a minor, Dwayne Scrooge Jr. could not have his name openly out to the authorities, although it was hardly mattered. The news that anyone enrolled at Truman was being charged with such a serious crime would bring a horrible publicity, and Dr. Dressler anticipated a strong reaction from the school board of trustees, not to mention some of the wealthy donors. The fire department called about an hour ago, Jason Marshall said. It sounds like they've got all the evidence they need. Dr. Dressler didn't bother asking for details. Given the boy's history of setting fires, the headmaster had no doubt that Dwayne Scrooge Jr. was guilty. Obviously, there was a good reason why the other students called him Smoke. It's only 20 minutes until school's dismissed, Dr. Dressler said. Can't we wait? The detective said, no, can we just get this over with? Dr. Dressler checked the schedule and saw that Dwayne was in Mr. Richo's English seminar. It's probably better if you stay here, the headmaster told Jason Marshall, who agreed. The classroom was on the other side of the campus, and Dr. Dressler hurried to get there. Dwayne Scrooge Jr. showed little emotion when the headmaster tapped on the door and summoned him outside. Halfway to the administration building, the boy finally asked what he was being called out of class for. We've got a problem, Dwayne, said Dr. Dressler. What do you mean? A man from the sheriff department wants to speak with you. Again? How come? Is your father home? Because you're probably going to want to give him a call later. When heck freezes over, the boy said. Truman School had a strict rule against cussing, but Dr. Dressler let it slide. Dwayne Jr. was a large person, and the headmaster didn't want to rile him up. He knew the detective was far more experienced at handling such situations. Jason Marshall, as it turned out, was waiting with a set of handcuffs. No way, muttered Dwayne Jr. and realized what was happening. I'm sorry, son, the detective said. Please turn around. The boy didn't move. He sighed heavily, rolled his eyes toward the ceiling. This is so wrong, he said. Dr. Dresser was now extremely nervous. Nobody had ever been arrested in the office before. Dwayne, please do what Detective Marshall says. Slowly, very slowly, the boy turned around. Thank goodness, thought the headmaster. And then, just as Jason Marshall stepped forward to snap on the cuffs, Dwayne Scrooge Jr. bolted out the door. Hey, shouted the detective, charging after him. Stop! Dr. Dresser stood there alone, dumbfounded and flustered. He felt like it was an escape episode from the cops. The headmaster looked out the window in time to see Dwayne Scrooge Jr. sprinting toward the athletic field. For such a stocky kid, he was very quick, and he steadily widened the gap between himself and the detective. Dr. Dresser wondered why nobody had ever asked Dwayne Scrooge Jr. into playing football, which was a dire need of a fullback. The lacrosse squad was out practicing on the west end of the field, and Dwayne Scrooge Jr. made a beeline for one of the players. Even from a distance, Dr. Dresser easily identified the student as Nick Waters because of the bulky sling contraption that he wore on his right shoulder. The headmaster watched in puzzlement as Dwayne Scrooge Jr. pulled Nick aside and spoke to him briefly, and then again the boy dashed away, jumping a chain link fence and vanishing into the deep stand of the pine trees. Detective Jason Marshall ran far behind, waving and hollering. Dr. Dresser didn't think that Dwayne Scrooge Jr. had any friends at Truman School, so he wondered why the kid had singled out Nick Waters to speak to, and what message could have been so important as to prompt him to interrupt his escape. Had Dr. Dresser been able to hear every word that Dwayne Scrooge Jr. said at the practice field, he might have reserved his opinion about the arson at the Blackvine Swamp. The thing that the boy said to Smoke told Nick was, "Your biology book's in my locker. The combination is 535. And the second thing he said was, I didn't do the fire, man. I'm innocent." End of chapter 16.